Hi, Dr. P here to describe to you how reality intrudes when you're making a non-abstract game, because when you set the parameters for the game world, in effect, you're setting constraints that you have to respect. So, when you make a non-abstract game, you have to decide about things like gravity and so on, and usually you just take Earth norm. You may have to decide about politics. You may have to decide about uh, the business environment and so on. These are constraints that you have to work within as well as the players, because players will look at those constraints and say, does this game make sense? And if it doesn't, then your game becomes a contradictory mess. Inevitably, some choices make certain things impossible because that's the nature of constraints. Now I'm going to take the example of fictional worlds and how difficult it would be to make a game of a certain type without accepting the foolishness of those fictional worlds, in effect. Example, Star Wars. Now, I love Star Wars movies, but the Star Wars world is dumb. In Star Wars, the spaceships are so fast that they can arrive in next to no time anywhere. Someone calculated their speed at 25,000 light years a day. They also have instantaneous communication using palm-size devices. In Clone Wars, which is part of Star Wars canon, ships can also pinpoint their exit from hyperspace, turning up in formation close to firing range of an opponent. Now, how can you defend anything in that context? How can you have a war in that context? It's not a war, it's just a massacre. Now, on the other hand, no one ever burns off a planet in Star Wars except for the foolish Death Star. Now, foolish I say because any large spaceship, and the Star Wars spaceships are pretty large, can toss rocks, whether manufactured or small asteroids, onto a planet and virtually destroy it. Who needs a Death Star? More nonsense. How does this affect military strategy that people don't burn off planets? Can there be any strategy in this situation? I won't even mention how troops rarely take cover and somehow aren't subject to friendly fire, even though the troops behind them are all firing at the enemy and firing right past them somehow. So if you were going to try to make a game in Star Wars, then you've got to try to pick a situation where none of this applies, maybe a tactical situation, or you're going to have to accept the nonsense because people accept the nonsense in the movies. Now, in modern times, we accept cheating in the way TV and movie writers cheat regularly about reality, or at least most of us do. But if you're making your own parameters, your own world, you don't have that buy-in. If your parameters that you set up for your world are nonsense, people are just going to say that's nonsense. In Star Wars, they've seen all the movies, or several of the movies, and they bought in. Now, as I was writing this business about Star Wars, it reminded me of Masters of Orion 2, which was one of the classic 4X games, video games. One time when I played Masters of Orion 2, the enemy got together a gigantic fleet that I probably couldn't have defeated if I'd had all my ships, and then just jumped from one place to another, capturing my planets. I didn't know exactly where they were going to jump to, so there's no way I could concentrate my forces. I was doomed. But that's a different situation in Star Wars. In Star Wars, this would be easy to happen. Get a big fleet, go your 25,000 light years. You couldn't defend Coruscant. You couldn't defend anywhere from a big offensive fleet. Now let's try another one, Barsoom. And I love Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom stories, John Carter stories. Don't think of the movie, though, because that was a mess. In the John Carter stories, the Martians have rifles with immense accurate range, and they have battleships with very large guns on them as well. Yet most of the fighting, aside from battleship to battleship, is with swords. The excuse is that there's an element of honor preventing fighters, even bad guys, from using hand weapons against swordsmen. Now, we accept that for the sake of the stories, but it's just not believable, especially when John Carter slaughters dozens of enemy swordsmen who have to come at him from a narrow place, and they have pistols in their holders. Do you really believe that as they're down to the last 10 guys at least, they don't just back up and pull their guns and shoot him? No, I don't believe it. But, again, as with so many elements of TV and movies, we accept for the sake of the story. But it could make for real problems in a tactical game. If I were going to make a Barsoom game, it would be strategic, where you'd have armies and fleets fighting each other, and then you know they'd be using guns, and you would avoid the problem. Now, you can try to legislate behavior, that is, put something into your rules that tells people they need to behave a particular way, or do oddball things like give victory points for fighting. If the game constraints otherwise discourage fighting, that's what's done in Eclipse, and it's nonsense. Or trying to cope with camping or turtling, depending on whether you come from video games or tabletop games, when there's a good way to succeed within the rules by camping or turtling. Some people are going to do that. You need to change your design so that camping or turtling does not lead to success. And that can be done, but it's work. The point of all this is, examine the parameters you've specified for your world, even if it's a historical world, for the natural consequences. And you may find that what you're trying to do doesn't make sense. Now, once again, if you're basing it on somebody else's IP, there may already be a buy-in for the nonsense. But if you're making up your own world, then you don't have that buy-in for the nonsense, and you may be sorry. Thanks for listening.